Hi, this is Jason with Green Star Productions. Welcome to the second part of my refinishing a tabletop video. In the previous video, you saw me take this tabletop down to bare wood and route out some recesses and cavities. And in this section of the video, I'm going to fill those cavities up with pigmented resin. And then you'll see me uh, finish off the table with a second type of resin that I'd never experimented with before doing this project, and I'm pretty happy with the results. And hopefully y'all find this interesting and enjoy watching it. And if you do, if you could hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if you'd like to see more of these videos that I'm going to put out in the future, we're going to jump right into it. Now, as you see here, I've got the mica powders that I'm going to use to color this resin. There's the Aztec Gold, which is just a dark gold, a Duo Blue Green, and then the Apple Green. Now I chose these colors because I figured they went well with the emerald green that I'd used in the first section on the table, which was the central trefoil pattern. Now for filling these cavities, I'm just going to use basic Alumilite resin. This is just a standard two-part casting resin, measured out by weight and not by volume, which is why you see me using this scale and pouring it right into this big old mixing cup. I really can't say enough good things about Alumilite, and they're not paying me to say this. This has just been my opinion. I've had so many good results using this, whether it's on a tabletop or in a pressure pot or just letting it air cure. So, being that I knew I was filling some recesses, I just decided to go ahead and use this basic resin for that purpose. Sorry for stumbling there for a moment. Now, as with all resins, of course, they all differ by the instructions and what you have to do to get them to work correctly. Now, with Alumilite, it says the directions say to mix for 2 minutes when you're blending the parts A and B together. I always mix it for longer than that, just to make sure I've gotten that resin completely mixed, because I don't want to have to deal with soft spots or uncured sections later on. Because that's just annoying having to dig that out and start all over, and it's just way more trouble than it's worth. Just take that extra time and mix the resin together thoroughly. Now, when I was doing the planning for this project, I knew, of course, I wasn't going to have equal amounts of all the colors. So when I finished doing my markup in the last video, doing the paint by numbers section, as it were, I realized I was going to need the most gold resin, bit less of the blue resin, and then I thought I was going to need very little of the green. Turns out I mistook those last two, because I wasn't sitting there doing math with a calculator. I was just trying to do it by eye, and I did it wrong. But that's not that big of a problem, because you can just go back and mix up more. Now this is the most intricate resin casting I've done, so this was something of an experiment for me to see just how difficult it was to do three non-mixing colors at once. So again, I was playing around. I was just experimenting with it. Now, as you see here, now that I've gotten the resin completely mixed, I'm dividing it into the 3 cups, and not the same amount in each, of course. And then I'm going to add the pigments to it. Now, for anybody unfamiliar with pigmenting powders, this is just colored mica flakes that have just been ground down to a very fine grade and then colored. So you get these, it's always going to be, that's the mica flex is why you get these colors shimmer when they're in resin or anything else you might suspend them in. Now, what you're going to see here in a minute, I'm going to use the I'm going to dump the pigments into the cups, of course, but the one problem you do have with these pigment powders is that they don't come with any type of little scoop or anything. What I've found works best, just because of the size of the jars, and you have to use such small amounts of these, at least for the size of projects I've been doing, is that I've been using these plastic dessert spoons. These little tiny spoons about the size of the ones you'd use with a cup of espresso. And you can get these at any party store, or you can get them at the grocery store, or places like that. As you see, I'm starting with the gold powder here, and I'm just using... Now, I probably didn't need to use this much of the powder, because I used a full heaping spoonful, and then I thought, hey, maybe I'll add a little more. But I was just trying to make sure I got the resin as opaque as I could, just because I didn't want anything to show through that, real pretty gold. But I admit to being a bit of a sucker for this particular pigment. And now I'm swapping to the blue-green. Again, I probably overdid it with the powder, considering the amount of the blue that I actually used. But these are the things we learn when we're experimenting. And I do apologize. This was of course, this is the first video I've shot, so didn't quite get my blocking right, so you can't see me dumping the apple green powder into the third cup at the top of the screen. But you get the idea. I'll improve with the next one, I promise. Now again, when you're whether you're using pigment powders or alcohol inks or anything else, anytime you're adding anything to resin, because it's so viscous, it's so thick, you have to make sure that you scrape down the sides when you're mixing all of these together, because otherwise you're going to end up leaving half of that real pretty pigment or ink on the side of the cup that you're mixing it up in. So again, just scrape down the sides as you stir. And what you end up with, as you'll see here in just a second, you get this. See how it looks almost like molten gold? Oh, I love seeing that every time I've worked with it. It's just so pretty. Okay, I took a second here and noticed that I'd gotten some of the gold pigment on my glove, so I wiped that off so I didn't end up dropping it in, end up scraping it into the blue resin. See, again, just scraped down the sides, kept mixing, and scrape. Now, as you can see a little hint of the green here in the cup, and I thought, wow, that's going to look really nice when it's on the table. Turns out it didn't come out quite like I was expecting, but it didn't come out bad. And finally, of course, I turned my attention to the green. Again, just scrape. Now, I probably could have just done, mix up the resin, left it sitting in the mixing cup, and just dump the pigment in one at a time. But I was trying to be careful about the working time I had with the pot time rather that I had with the resin, because I didn't want it to start setting up while I was fiddling around with filling these small cavities. As you see here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work with the furthest away section from me, because what you can't see is there's a workbench right in front of where I'm standing. So I couldn't exactly go around to that side. Even if the camera hadn't been there, I wouldn't have been able to reach it. So I'm trying to work, on that furthest away section from me, since I've got such a small working space for this. And since I'm working with such small and shallow recesses that I'm trying to fill, you'll see in a lot of these that I just scrape up some resin on the popsicle stick and scrape it right into the reservoir, and I move it around from there, just trying to make sure I hit all the corners and get as far into it as I can. And try not to make a mess, because anything I spill here, I'm going to end up having to sand off later, and that's just, why do more of that than you have to? I already know I'm going to have to do it at least once. Don't want to do it more than that if I can avoid it. And it's here I am doing it again, just scraping out some of the blue. And here we've jumped. Now I've finished all the blue at this point, and I've moved on to the gold. So I'm just doing the same basic process. I'm just scraping it up with the stick and dabbing it on in. With a lot of these gold sections, since they were right next to other colors, I really wanted to make sure I got those uh, filled in. I didn't have any gaps where it was touching that uh, next resin section, because that'll just look weird if you have these gaps that's just filled with clear resin, particularly in a piece like this. If the piece was entirely clear, I wouldn't have bothered so much, but this is wood, so I wanted to make sure that those sections were touching, which is what the original design had called for. All right, and now you see me beginning to. I think I've gotten the hang of it at this point. So, and working with a bigger section with this big circle, so I just dumped it right out of the cup and working it to the edge. Now you see, if you watch, I'm working this to the edge fairly hard, because these recesses I marked them out with a hole saw, and while the recesses themselves are only about 1/4 of an inch deep, the actual outline of the circle is at least 1/2 an inch deep, because the hole saw had to go, of course, into the wood. And being a liquid, the resin was going to flow in and try to fill that section first. And if I'm trying to gauge how much resin I need, and if I'll have to make any more, I'm just trying to get a head start on that process by just pushing the resin in there myself. Mm. You see, and I'm trying to get this as I've, I've always felt it was more important to get the resin pushed out to any recesses, the edges, the very edges, and particularly the corners of anything you're filling this way. Because you can always add more resin later, and it'll, of course, mix together. But it's just a pain in the butt if you've tried to fill it up and you end up, didn't realize that because of the way you poured the resin into the cavity that first time, you ended up with an air bubble right in the corner. And then you have to go back with a real small syringe or something else and just try to back and fill these little cavities. That's just annoying. So again, just take my advice on this one. Just if you're filling a recess this way, make sure you push it into the corners first, and then add if you have to fill up the entirety of the cavity. All right, here I've finished with pouring most of the gold sections. I'm just scraping the last of it out of the cup at this point, just trying to top up where I'd already poured the gold, trying not to waste resin. All right, and as you see, it's a little hard to see. You can definitely see one, but not the other section that are not filled with the colored resin. Now here what you see is I'm pushing that light green back into this circle, because it turns out I had a problem with the table being level. So once I'd leveled it out, of course, then I have to go back and clean up the resin this way. So it turns out I'd actually, as you'll see here in a minute, I had not mixed up enough of the apple green resin. So I just scraped out what I could of the cup, and then went back later and mixed up another batch, added the green pigment, and filled it up the rest of the way. The other recess that I had a problem with was I had actually marked it too close to one of the blue arc sections, and when I poured the resin in that blue section, it just flowed right through little holes in the wood. I'd apparently torn it up underneath the surface somehow, and it just I had blue resin that was flowing into what was supposed to be a gold cavity. So I had to stop what I was doing, get some 5-minute epoxy and fix that little wall, scrape as much out of the blue as I could. Luckily, I caught it pretty early on, so it wasn't that big of a problem. And then, of course, poured the rest of the gold resin in that. All right, and here's what it looks like. Now I have a little hard to see. There's the blue section, blue running into the gold section that I just was talking about. Rest of this looks pretty good. The only thing I still have to do at this point is I got to mix up some more of that light green and fill the last of that little reservoir you see right there. But other than that, it looked pretty good, I felt. And here it is a day later. I've, of course, filled up those 2 remaining cavities, and I've taken it out and sanded it at this point. So it doesn't look bad, but the edges are a little, blurred and choppy because I'd cut them all by hand instead of, on a CNC machine, which I don't have. So I decided, all right, I went back in with a marker and just, outlined all of these edges in black. Just a regular old Sharpie, and it came out looking pretty clean and neat, if I do say so myself, as you see right here. Now I'd also added some stenciled in designs with a stencil I created myself, just to make it a little more interesting. And what you see, the resin you see me pouring on the tabletop at this point is a completely different brand. This is a tabletop resin as opposed to a casting resin. The difference being that the tabletop resins are intended to be, they're mixed to be a bit thinner, not nearly as viscous and thick as a casting resin. As you can see, this is spreading out really fast all over the tabletop. Oop. And you see I almost knocked it right off of the painter's triangles I was using to hold it up. And it's sitting over freezer paper, which I've just put down to catch the resin that dripped off since I knew that was going to happen. And I did this because it was just it's easy to clean up this way, and I don't end up having to sand down my secondary workstation. And this is the really fun and messy part. Because I just grab just a regular old plastic spatula at this point. I'm just spreading it out across the surface, just trying to make sure I cover every inch of it, because this tabletop resin will self-level to within about 1/8 of an inch, which is pretty good. Of course, that doesn't do you any good if you've left a bare spot on the surface. So I just go over this several times just to make sure I didn't skip anything in my eagerness and haste to move on to another part of the project. Yep, here we go. The fun, messy part. It just goes right over the edge this way. And all I'm doing here is, I'm just running my fingers around, just trying to make sure, again, I get a nice base coat across the entirety of that blue painted edge of the table. Again, with that same principle, it's not going to do you any good to have it leveled out if you end up with a lumpy section where part of it was covered by resin, part of it is just regular paint and wood. So I just do this several times, and it's always a real fun, and that satisfies that little kid part of you that liked playing in the mud, getting messy everywhere, and just smear it all the way around the edge. At least that's what I've always done. Because again, fluid dynamics being what they are, as it evens itself out, it'll drip off wherever it can connect. Boy, that was not that. I don't think that sounded very clear or illuminating. What I mean is, if you cover the entire surface with a liquid, it'll all run off at the same rate, and you'll end up with a nice even coat across the entire surface, whether that's nice flat surface on the top or the rounded edge of the table in this case. You just make sure that the whole thing is covered in in the tabletop resin, and it will, with the help of gravity, it will drag itself off and leave you with a nice even coat across the entire surface. Now, unfortunately, what I did not know, since this is the first time I was dealing with this type of resin, is that I really should have mixed up some more. I had just enough to cover the surface, but I should really have been willing to waste a bit more, because I ended up having to go back. There ended up being a little gap, a place that didn't get quite covered with enough resin, and it left a little gap that I knew was just going to bother me. So I had to go back, and I sanded down this coat and then put another on top of it. But we'll discuss that more when the video catches up. Now I probably could have just left it alone at this point, because I've spread the resin off across the surface as best I can, and overnight the resin's going to run off and set itself up. But I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I just like playing with the stuff. So as you see, I just keep scraping, keep scraping and moving, just trying to get it as close to even as I can before I let gravity do its job. And just as with regular casting resin, you'll see this here in a couple of minutes. To eliminate the bubbles that come up as the resin begins to cure and sink into the wood, I use a heat gun to it heats up the epoxy and makes it a bit runnier. It's kind of like heating up honey. And as it becomes thinner, the air that's trapped in it, the little bubbles, have an easier time rising to the surface and popping themselves, as opposed to trying to force them out any other way. I mean, technically, you could do it if you had a large enough vacuum chamber, but I've never seen a vacuum chamber that would have taken a tabletop. And it's also kind of fun to just run a heat gun across a large surface like this. Okay, and as you can see, I did not plan on needing the heat gun at this point, so I hadn't dug it out and plugged it in. So I had to run off camera to go grab that and plug it in here. Now, the other problem I ran into is that I ended up with a bug that had gotten attracted to the resin for whatever reason, landed on the surface and got stuck there too. So between that and it not being there being a little gap, I ended up having to again take it down to sanded up this top coat and put another on top. Now, as you can see here, since the resin's still settling, so you can still see little grooves where I'd taken the spatula and dragged it across. But that's okay. Like I said, these evened out on their own. And I already liked this design better than the original that you saw if you watched the first part of the video. So I just let this set overnight and ended up with that bug in it. Here we are. I had finally remembered where I'd put my heat gun at this point. So you just see me here again going over the surface, just trying to make sure I hit everything, just trying to get at as many of these bubbles as I can. So just being a little painstaking here, just moving it about an inch at a time, going back and forth and back and forth, just being a perfectionist. Because the fewer bubbles you have in the resin, of course, the clearer it's going to come out. And I like this design so much, I didn't want to lose any of it to bubbles if I didn't have to. And again, I just let this sit overnight. Ended up with that bug in it, so I sanded it down, added another coat, but I put it in, as you'll see here in just a minute, that I put it in actually a Christmas wreath, a plastic Christmas wreath storage box that I had laying around the house, so I could put a lid on it, and it kept bugs and hair and everything else floating in the air from getting in the resin. and it came out, and it's just, the surface is just perfect. So after this had dried, I took it out, flipped it over, I sanded off the little drips that had accumulated on the bottom, and instead of the high chair legs that I'd used on the first version of this table, as you can see here, I attached it to the leg set I had from an old TV tray from another project that I had just laying around. And that does it for the end of this build. Hope you all enjoyed the video. If please leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and check back. I'm going to try to add videos as quick as I can make them. And if you're curious about this piece and some of the other artwork I've done, you can check the links below. It'll link to my website, to my DeviantArt portfolio, and you can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that. I'll leave those links down below as well. I'd like to thank you all for checking out this video, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are, and hope to see you again real soon.